Introduction to what juvenile courts are. Juvenile court systems are basically the same as adult systems, but they're more geared towards educational and rehabilitating purposes rather than punishment. It was first brought for those juveniles because they were committing lesser crimes, less serious crimes, but nowadays that has definitely changed. Juveniles are committing more serious crimes, so their punishments are getting harder to assess. But it's pretty much the same thing as the adult court system. They do have a due process is the same. They're just judged less. Punishment is more based off of intake, past behavior, rather than just the situation in itself. The process is a little bit different. It goes from intake, diversion, detention, judicial processing, and dismissal, probation, secure correctional placement, and reentry. Intro continued. In Regault case, it was Junior Gault, a 15-year-old accused of making obscene phone calls to a neighbor. He was arrested when his parents weren't present, nor were they notified. They came home and had no idea he was arrested. They weren't present for the hearings, nor was there any solid accounts in which he was confirmed to be the one making the calls. He was charged with lewd phone calls, and he was sentenced to 6 years in juvenile detention center until he turned 21. But if he was an adult being charged for the same thing, the maximum would have been a $50 fine and 2 months jail time. This is a great example to show detention centers weren't really working towards rehabilitation.
Main causes leading to juvenile delinquency. What are the leading causes that result in juvenile delinquency? According to an article written by attorney Mark Nicewise, he contributes juvenile delinquency to the following 7 causes: violence at home, lack of moral guidance and supervision, poor educational quality, poor school performance, substance abuse, peer pressure, socioeconomic factors, and their lives just started fight for their rights. These issues have one main factor in common, which is the lack of stability in their homes and in their lives. One of the most widespread and leading reasons for juvenile crime is violence at home. A home is where the child learns what kind of a person to grow into. Children must be protected from all kinds of crime if we can identify what causes juveniles to fall down the path that leads them to criminal behavior. Then we can help change their actions in the future. This is why the last factor states, their lives just started, fight for their rights. This means that children are young, impressionable, and need guidance. Punishment isn't always the answer, and looking at what causes the delinquent behavior of children is a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. If we are able to intervene before these children commit criminal acts, it would result in juvenile courts and juvenile detention centers becoming obsolete. Issues, cons with juvenile courts. There are many issues when it comes to juvenile courts. Not only juvenile courts, but the juvenile justice system as a whole. Some of these issues include minors faced with punishment instead of rehabilitation, delays, informality, no orientation to juveniles, and no juries. As mentioned in the introduction, the Supreme Court case Regault argued that juveniles should be allowed due process. However, 55 years after this case was decided, there are still issues relating to the due process of juveniles. One main issue is the absence of juries of juvenile cases. This is to protect the identity of the juveniles. However, the Fifth Amendment allows every citizen the right to due process. Informality is another violation of the Fifth Amendment because it denies juveniles the same formal process of sentencing that adult offenders are provided. Juvenile courts were set up with the idea that informal proceedings would be beneficial for young offenders, but in reality, informality has become a disadvantage because it overlooks juvenile defendants' due process rights. No orientation for juveniles is the juvenile court's lack of ability to adequately address the problems of these juveniles. And in turn, these courts often opt for quick fixes such as coercion and imprisonment rather than long-term solutions. The lack of rehabilitation and opting for punishment and imprisonment is the most widely disputed issue when discussing the need for juvenile courts. Critics of juvenile courts argue that it has failed in its rehabilitation efforts. In the earlier slide, we looked at the main causes of juvenile delinquency. And when talking about minor children and their criminal behavior, it is clear that there is more going on that needs to be addressed than the crimes being committed. An adolescent's brain cannot regulate emotions and understand consequences the same as an adult brain, and they should not be subjected to the same punishment of incarceration. Critics also argue that the landscape has changed considerably since the early 1900s. Drugs, gangs, and the availability of guns have led to juveniles committing many serious crimes, including murder. Critics insist that juvenile courts are no longer adequate to address problems caused by violent, amoral young people. Since there has been a significant change from the early 1900s until now, we need to reevaluate the operation of juvenile courts and make changes to the juvenile justice system accordingly.
Why should juvenile courts be abolished? For starters, there are multiple deficiencies throughout the juvenile court system, such as a failure to rehabilitate violent youth, a reputation for lenient sentences, and an overall lack of reputable numbers that have led many to criticize the authority and efficiency of the juvenile court system. Juvenile courts are expensive. For example, counties in California now spend $300,000 to incarcerate one youth for a year. Yet, we see about 76% of the youths released from juvenile facilities rearrested within 3 years. Perhaps the most namely reason the courts should be abolished is for the controversial sentencing of violent offenders. It is wrong for juvenile offenders who have committed violent crimes to be released from jurisdiction of the juvenile court at ages 18 or 21. Serving a few years in a juvenile correction facility for a crime that, if committed by an adult, would result in a 10-year sentence is not only unfair, it's putting possible offenders back in public prematurely. The punishment for a crime should be the same regardless of the age of the perpetrator, especially if it's a violent act.
Why should the juvenile courts be abolished? Continued. The main reason why they should be abolished is because juveniles commit more serious crimes today more than ever. Drugs, weapons, and gangs are all leading to more serious crimes committed by juveniles. Juvenile courts are just not meant to handle this much and this series of crimes. Another very important reason why they need to be abolished is the lack of jury. With these types of crimes, like murder and with drugs, a jury should be present. Everyone should have the right to a jury, no matter their age. It should not be up to the judge to determine guilty or innocent. It should be the same for adults and for children.
The primary goals of the juvenile justice system, in addition to maintaining public safety, are skills developed, rehabilitation, addressing treatment needs, and successful reintegration of youth in the community. The juvenile justice system takes a significantly more restorative approach than the adult criminal justice system. A truly successful case for youth would result in the adolescent learning from the experience without exposure to the severity of the adult prison, altering their decisions and life course moving forward, and having no future contact with the juvenile or criminal justice systems. Even though the juvenile courts are there to help and protect juveniles from committing more crimes in the future, it is psychologically draining. Youth involved with the juvenile justice system often have mental health and substance use disorders. These typically affect their academic performance, behavior, and relationships with peers and adults. Many youth who encounter the juvenile justice system have experienced academic failure, disengagement from the school, and or school disciplinary challenges. Academic outcomes for these youth are generally less positive than those of youth who do not encounter the system, suggesting that academic interventions may be a strong avenue for serving youth at risk of entering the juvenile system.
In conclusion, according to statistics, an adolescent's brain isn't fully developed until their mid-20s. Therefore, adolescents are incapable of making thorough decisions without fully understanding the consequences. For example, in the case above, a 15-year-old had his life drastically changed from an action where he could not possibly see the consequences. So to take 6 years from his life is completely unfair. Minors today are faced with punishment when the main focus should be rehabilitation. There are many deficiencies found in the juvenile court system, which is why we believe they should be abolished.